I'm going to tell you about the most devastating betrayal I've ever experienced and how a tiny digital recorder hidden in a hospital room exposed a truth so cruel it still takes my breath away. My name is Samantha, and this is the story of how my mother-in-law tried to steal not just my inheritance, but the very memory of my marriage. It started with what should have been the happiest news of my life. After 6 years of marriage to my wonderful husband James, I was finally pregnant. We'd struggled with infertility for so long that we'd almost given up hope. When I saw those two pink lines on the pregnancy test, I cried tears of pure joy. James was over the moon. He immediately started planning the nursery, researching the best schools in our area, and talking about teaching our child to play guitar just like his father had taught him. We were both 34, financially stable, and ready to become parents. Everything seemed perfect. Then came the phone call that shattered our world. "Samantha, I need you to sit down," Dr. Reynolds said, his usually cheerful voice heavy with concern. James's blood work from his routine physical showed some abnormalities. We need him to come in for more tests immediately. 3 weeks later, we sat in an oncologist's office listening to words that felt like they were coming from someone else's nightmare. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months to live, maybe less. The cancer had already spread to his liver and lungs. There were treatment options that might extend his life by a few months, but they would be brutal and ultimately futile. I was 12 weeks pregnant when my husband received his death sentence. James took the news with a grace that broke my heart. "We're going to fight this," he said, holding my hand tightly. "I want to meet our baby. I want to be a father, even if it's just for a little while." We decided to try the aggressive treatment protocol, knowing it would be hell but hoping for a miracle. James underwent chemotherapy that left him weak and nauseated, radiation that burned his skin, and experimental treatments that offered more hope than real results. Through it all, I tried to be strong for both of us. I worked from home so I could drive him to appointments, held his head when the chemo made him sick, and rubbed his feet when the medications made them ache. We spent hours talking about our unborn child, choosing names, and making plans for a future we both knew was slipping away. But there was another presence in our lives during this nightmare. James's mother, Patricia. Patricia had never liked me from the moment James introduced us 7 years earlier. I wasn't the type of woman she'd envisioned for her only son. I was a graphic designer from a middle-class family, while she'd hoped he'd marry someone from their social circle, someone with old money and the right connections. She tolerated our relationship and eventually our marriage, but she never missed an opportunity to make subtle digs about my background or capabilities. When James got sick, Patricia immediately inserted herself into every aspect of his care. She had opinions about his doctors, his treatments, and especially about how I was handling the situation. "Samantha looks exhausted," she'd say to James when she thought I couldn't hear. "This stress can't be good for the baby. Maybe she should consider staying with her parents for a while, just until you're feeling better." "Mom, I need Samantha here with me," James would reply, but I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. The medications and pain were making him more susceptible to suggestion, more dependent on others for basic decisions. As his condition worsened, Patricia became even more aggressive in her campaign to separate us. She started visiting the hospital during my work hours, when I'd step out briefly to handle urgent projects that were keeping our insurance active and paying for James' experimental treatments. "You work too much," she told me one afternoon. "James needs his wife's full attention right now, not someone who's more concerned about her career." What she didn't know was that I was desperately trying to keep our finances stable. James' illness had already cost us his salary, and the medical bills were mounting despite our insurance. My freelance work was the only thing keeping us afloat, but I couldn't explain this to Patricia without admitting how dire our financial situation had become. The pregnancy was becoming more difficult too. The stress of James's illness, combined with the exhaustion of caring for him, was taking a toll on my body. I was experiencing complications that required bed rest, but I couldn't bear to leave James alone in the hospital. That's when Patricia made her move. "Samantha, dear," she said one day, her voice dripping with false concern. "I've been thinking. Why don't you let me take over James's care for a few weeks? You need to focus on the baby, and I can be here with him full-time. I've already spoken to my employer about taking extended leave." James was having a particularly bad day, weak from his latest round of chemotherapy and struggling to stay awake for more than a few hours at a time. When he heard his mother's offer, he looked at me with eyes full of guilt. "Maybe Mom's right, Sam. You need to take care of yourself and the baby. I don't want anything to happen to you because of me." Against every instinct in my body, I agreed to let Patricia take over his primary care for 2 weeks while I followed doctor's orders for bed rest. It was the biggest mistake of my life. During those 2 weeks, Patricia barely let me speak to James on the phone. When I did manage to reach him, he sounded different, distant, and confused. He started asking strange questions about our finances, about my family, about decisions I'd supposedly made without consulting him. "Sam, Mom says you've been meeting with lawyers about my will," he said during one brief call. "Is that true?" I was shocked. "James, I haven't spoken to any lawyers. I wouldn't make decisions about your will without you. We need to discuss that together." But his response chilled me to the bone. "I don't know what to believe anymore. Mom says a lot of things, and you're not here to defend yourself." When I tried to visit the hospital the next day, Patricia met me at the elevator. "I'm sorry, Samantha, but James isn't up for visitors today. He's having a very difficult time, and the doctors think too much stimulation might be harmful." "I'm not a visitor," I said, my voice rising. "I'm his wife." "And I'm his mother," she replied coldly. "I've been taking care of him since before you existed, and I know what's best for him right now." Security was called when I refused to leave, and I found myself escorted from the hospital where my dying husband was being kept from me by his own mother. That night, I called James' oncologist directly. "Dr. Martinez, this is Samantha. I need to know what's happening with my husband's care. His mother is preventing me from seeing him." There was a long pause. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm confused. According to my records, your husband's medical power of attorney was changed last week. His mother is now listed as his primary decision maker." The world tilted sideways. "That's impossible. I never agreed to that. James would never." "I'm sorry, but the paperwork was filed properly and appears to be in order. If you have concerns, you'll need to address them with the family directly." That night, I barely slept. Something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't figure out how to fix it. James was dying, I was pregnant and on bed rest, and somehow I'd been completely cut out of my own husband's medical care. 3 days later, Patricia called me with the news I'd been dreading. "Samantha, you need to come to the hospital immediately. James is asking for you. I think it's time." I drove to the hospital in a state of panic and grief, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I reached James' room, I barely recognized the man in the bed. He'd lost so much weight, and his skin had a grayish pallor that told me everything I needed to know. "Sam," he whispered when he saw me, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I took his hand, fighting back tears. "Sorry for what, baby? You have nothing to be sorry for." "The will," he said, his eyes struggling to focus. "I changed the will. Mom said, she said you didn't want the burden. She said you wanted to start fresh after I'm gone." My heart stopped. "James, what are you talking about? What did you change?" But he was fading again, the pain medication pulling him back into unconsciousness. I looked at Patricia, who was standing in the corner with an expression I couldn't read. "What did you do?" I demanded. "I protected my son's interests," she said quietly. "He was making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. I helped him see clearly." James died 6 hours later, with me holding one hand and Patricia holding the other. My last words to him were "I love you," but I'll never know if he heard them. The funeral was a blur of condolences and casseroles, but the real shock came a week later when Patricia asked me to meet her at her lawyer's office for the reading of James's will. The document was devastating. According to the new will, James had left me a small life insurance policy, enough to cover immediate expenses, but everything else went to Patricia. The house we bought together, his savings, his retirement accounts, even his personal belongings were now hers. "James was concerned about your ability to manage such a large inheritance while dealing with a new baby," the lawyer explained, reading from a letter James had supposedly written. He felt his mother would be better equipped to make long-term financial decisions and could provide better stability for his child. I sat there in stunned silence as Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of grieving mother who was reluctantly accepting this burden for the good of her grandchild. But something in the lawyer's tone made me look up. He seemed uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact as he read through the documents. After the meeting, I approached him privately. "Mr. Williams, was there something unusual about this will revision?" He hesitated, then said carefully, "Mrs. Anderson, I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've learned to trust my instincts. If you have any concerns about these documents, you might want to seek a second opinion." That was all the encouragement I needed. I hired my own attorney, Sarah Chin, who immediately began investigating the circumstances of the will change. What she found was deeply troubling. Samantha, the will was revised during a period when James was on heavy pain medication that can cause confusion and disorientation. More importantly, the witnesses to the signing were both employees of your mother-in-law's law firm. That's not illegal, but it's highly irregular for a personal will. Sarah also discovered that Patricia had filed papers claiming James was mentally incompetent due to his medication regimen, then immediately filed other papers granting her power of attorney based on this incompetence. It was a legal maneuver that gave her complete control over his decisions during his final weeks. But the breakthrough came when we returned to the hospital to collect James' personal belongings. Among his things was a small digital recorder that I'd given him months earlier so he could record voice memos when he had ideas for songs. James was a musician, and even during his illness, he'd sometimes get inspired to write lyrics or melodies. I almost threw the recorder away, assuming it was empty, but something made me plug it in and listen. What I heard made my blood turn to ice. The recorder had been voice-activated, so it had captured conversations in James's hospital room during his final weeks. Hours of audio that documented exactly what Patricia had done to manipulate my dying husband. "James, sweetheart, you need to think about what's best for everyone," Patricia's voice said in one recording. "Samantha is young. She'll remarry. She doesn't need the burden of managing your estate while raising a baby alone. But Mom, Sam, and I planned this together. The house is in both our names. She loves that house. She loves the idea of the house, but houses are expensive. Insurance, taxes, maintenance, it's too much for someone in her situation. I can sell it and invest the money for the baby's future." In another recording, Patricia was even more manipulative. "I spoke to Samantha yesterday, and she mentioned that she might want to move closer to her parents after you're gone. She said the house holds too many painful memories." She said that. James sounded confused and hurt. "She's trying to be strong for you, but I can see how much she's struggling. The best gift you can give her is the freedom to start over without the burden of your estate." But the most damning recording was from 2 days before James died. "James, the lawyer, is here with the new will. You just need to sign it, and then everything will be taken care of." "I'm so tired, Mom. Can we do this tomorrow?" "Sweetheart, tomorrow might be too late. You're getting weaker, and if something happens, Samantha and the baby won't be protected. This will ensure they'll be taken care of properly." I could hear James's labored breathing, the sound of papers rustling, and then his weak voice. "Where do I sign?" "Right here, sweetheart. You're doing the right thing." The recordings also captured Patricia coaching James on what to say if I visited or called, feeding him lies about conversations I'd never had and decisions I'd never made. When Sarah heard the recordings, she was furious. This is elder abuse, even though James wasn't elderly. She exploited his weakened mental state to manipulate him into changing his will. We have grounds to contest this completely. But I wanted more than just a legal victory. I wanted Patricia to face the truth of what she'd done. I called her and asked to meet privately at James's grave. She agreed, probably thinking I wanted to discuss visitation rights for the baby or some other practical matter. We sat on a bench near James's headstone, and I pulled out the digital recorder. "Patricia, I found something of James that I think you should hear." I pressed play on one of the most damning conversations, where she was telling him that I'd already started dating someone new and was planning to move away after he died. Her face went white as she heard her own voice manipulating her dying son. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. It was in James's personal belongings. The voice-activated recorder captured everything that happened in his room during his final weeks. I stopped the playback and looked at her directly. "Every lie you told him, every manipulation, every moment you exploited his love for me and his baby to turn him against us." Patricia started to cry, not the dignified tears she'd shown at the lawyer's office, but ugly, desperate sobs. "You don't understand," she gasped. "I was protecting him. "You're young, you'll find someone else." But I only had one son, and I needed something to remember him by. "So you decided to steal his wife's inheritance?" He convinced a dying man that the woman he loved was already betraying him. "I never meant for it to go that far. I couldn't bear the thought of you having everything when I was losing everything." I stood up, looking down at this broken woman who had caused so much pain. "Patricia, you didn't lose James. You threw him away. You spent his final weeks filling his head with lies instead of helping him find peace. You stole his last chance to trust in a love we shared." The legal battle that followed was swift. With the recordings as evidence, Patricia's manipulation was undeniable. The fraudulent will was overturned, and James's original will, which left everything to me, was reinstated. But more importantly, I was able to prove that James's final weeks had been poisoned by his mother's lies. The recordings showed that until Patricia's manipulation campaign, James had been completely devoted to me and excited about our baby. Patricia was forced to pay legal fees and was barred from any contact with me or my child. She also faced potential criminal charges for elder abuse, though she ultimately plea bargained to avoid jail time. My daughter Lily was born 3 months after James died. She has his dark hair and musical ability. But thankfully, she'll never know the grandmother who tried to steal her inheritance and destroy her parents' love story. I kept the house James and I bought together, and I've turned his music room into Lily's playroom. Sometimes I play the recordings for her, not the manipulative conversations, but the early ones where James talked about how excited he was to be her father and how much he loved me. "Your daddy loved us so much," I tell her as we listen to his voice. "He never stopped loving us, no matter what anyone tried to make him believe." The hardest part isn't the financial loss we almost suffered, it's knowing that James died believing I had betrayed him. Patricia stole his peace in his final moments, and that's something I'll never forgive. But I've learned something important about truth and love. Patricia thought she could rewrite our story, manipulate the facts to create a different reality where I was the villain and she was the victim. She almost succeeded. The truth, however, has a way of revealing itself. Love leaves evidence, and sometimes that evidence comes in the form of a small digital recorder that captures not just words, but the destruction of trust and the power of manipulation. Today, Lily is 2 years old, and she's the light of my life. I tell her stories about her father every day, sharing the man he really was. Not the confused, medicated patient Patricia manipulated, but the loving husband who was so excited to be a father. Patricia sends birthday cards that I throw away unopened. She's lost the right to be part of our story, just as she tried to write me out of James. But love endures, even beyond death, even beyond manipulation. And someday, when Lily is old enough to understand, I'll play her the recordings of her father talking about how much he loved her before she was even born. That's the inheritance Patricia could never steal, the love that survives every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to rewrite the truth. James loved us. The recordings prove it, and that's all that really matters.